So if you ask someone in Austin, not at an event like this, but in general, like, tell me about yourself, their job is not usually the first thing they say. It is very often my name, this is what I do for fun, this is what I listen to for music, this is my family. And it's one of the first thing I noticed when I moved here from the Bay Area like 6 or 7 years ago. I thought, oh my God, how refreshing. Like, I'm going to talk about something other than work. This is amazing. But I also think that like it hints to the fact that work isn't always like the number one thing on people's mind in Austin. Austin likes to be fit and work out, into music and culture. And in some cases that might end up being a little bit of a detractor to the ecosystem in some ways. Like, I think when you work at an early stage startup, like both of us have, like, you have to pour your life into it. And so sometimes I wonder if enough people in Austin for some of these businesses are like really, really grinding hard enough to really put Austin on the map. And I say that as someone who's in it. Like, I'm not, making a negative statement about the community, but it's just something I found.
Well, I want to hold on that, because it was really interesting, because Bill Gurley was on Bloomberg a number of weeks ago, and his comment was the problem that Austin and Miami, he combined together, said our problem is we're too fun. And that it very much echoed what you had said. And it was funny because I kind of stepped back for a moment, because now I've never lived in the Bay. I was in Southern California, but I kind of bristled a little more, because you're going to tell me people in the Bay don't have fun as well? There wasn't this kind of play hard, work hard.
As much fun as we do in Austin.
Okay, so that's an interesting, but it is an interesting that there is this kind of lifestyle first. But when you say this, is it more that there aren't, your perception, there aren't enough density of hyper ambitious types of people that are going to be building those global generational startups, or is it more of a narrative effect, because you said that the first thing they're going to say is, this is what I'm doing, but they might be hyper ambitious? Really, which bucket does it fall into?
Yeah, I think both are interesting points. I think the density thing is what I'm kind of getting at too, is that when you're surrounded by other people who are all working in similar work environments, it's sort of contagious. But the thing is, I think there are hyper ambitious people in Austin, but not all of those hyper ambitious people are necessarily working for a venture backed business. Like, there's a lot of people who are hyper ambitious in the medical field, or in fitness, or musicians, or artists, or in real estate, or in construction. There's a diversity of like industry too in Austin that I think, certainly exists in other cities. But if you're in Palo Alto, I mean, the density of people working, high ambitious people working at early stage venture backed startups is just really high.
Because it's been interesting, because on one hand we say that you have this lack of density, which I don't think anybody would take it's controversial or disagree with. But then this has been one of the number one place that a lot of people have moved, and recently a lot of heavyweights. So on one hand, it's like you're not having it, but then that's what has been attracting people.
Totally. I think, and then we have the additional layer of the COVID and post-COVID work from home era dynamic also playing out, where it's contagious to see highly ambitious, hardworking people when you're physically seeing them.
Right.
And now that companies are a lot more remote, I think that's the other thing that hinders us a little bit. But the densities, you just don't necessarily like run into this quite as often. And there are some spaces like this one that we're sitting in now, and Capital Factory and Techstars, but in terms of density of those spaces, they just don't exist quite as much.
No, it was really interesting. An episode I did recently with the author Chelsea Follett, the book 40 Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World. And we talked about Athens and Florence, and like literally you're walking down the street and you run into Socrates and Plato, and then you're in Florence, you're running into, Da Vinci and Raphael. Like literally you hit just that density of geniuses that are kind of going about. That's that agglomeration effect, right? You're running into all these different people, and you ask, how do you have those kind of creative collisions that happen here, where you just kind of turn around and interesting, hyper ambitious people are here?
So I would actually look at it as maybe from the glass half full perspective of, I think there's really the two silver linings are, one, I think Austin's a pretty friendly place. Like, one thing I hear from people that come to Austin, and I've heard this multiple times, is like, oh my gosh, like people just meet with me. And I think there's like a friendliness that encourages kind of collaboration and a welcomingness to all the newcomers during COVID and things like that. And I think that that's pretty unique relative to a lot of other ecosystems. And it's not overly transactional. And it really lets people get here and kind of get involved in the tech ecosystem. You know, I agree somewhat with what you said, Book earlier said. I take issue with lumping Austin and Miami in the same sentence. And the reason I take issue with that is, I think, to your point, the density. In that, and I think, by the way, the density of talent's improved in Austin in the last 3 years, probably a decade's worth. Like, we've invested in multiple repeat exited founders that have moved here from the coast during the last few years. But I think you have your what I call like your tier 1, your SF, and your New York that probably does have the highest density. But if you look at like some of the other sort of hot cities that have popped up, like Austin, like Miami, I think the difference is Austin hasn't just popped up in that we've had, you know, semiconductor industry in the 80s, enterprise software in the 90s and 2000s. You had the consumer growth equity roll-ups in like the, you know, 2010s ish plus, you know, that decade. And so I think what Austin does have going for it is a 20 to 30 year head start on the talent pool relative to what I call like the other tier 2 or sort of hot markets. Where like that doesn't happen overnight, and it's almost like impossible for that to happen overnight.